Beverly Johnson stood outside the wedding hall, clutching an invitation that never should have existed. Inside, the man she loved was marrying another woman, not because he didn't love her once, but because she was black, plus-sized, and broke. Earlier that morning, Beverly had stood at the altar in a shimmering white gown that cost her every penny of her life savings. She thought the dress would finally make her feel like she belonged, but as she reached for Michael Smith's hand, he didn't offer a ring. Instead, he slid a crisp, white envelope onto the velvet altar cushion, a hush money check and a legal non-disclosure agreement. The silence in the cathedral was deafening as Beverly looked toward the front row. There, sitting in the seat reserved for the groom's family, was a thin woman draped in emerald silk, Beverly's favorite color. The woman didn't look away. She smirked. Michael leaned in, his lips brushing Beverly's ear as if to offer a blessing, but his words were a serrated blade. "I loved the person you were in private, Beverly," he whispered, his voice catching the microphone so the entire room could hear the cruelty. "But I'm a man of ambition. I can't build an empire with a woman the board of directors will pity. You aren't presentable, you're a liability." A ripple of cruel laughter erupted from the pews. Her heart didn't just break. It was publicly executed. 6 hours later, Beverly landed in Seoul with a broken suitcase, $43, and a soul the world had taught her to hate. She thought distance would save her, but the moment she struggled with her bag at Incheon Airport, the sea of travelers parted like a dark tide. 3 men in tailored black suits stopped walking. One of them stepped forward. He had eyes like frozen obsidian and a scar tracing his jaw. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her like she was the most dangerous thing in the room. "Your suitcase is broken," the man, Kang Ji-wan, said, his voice a low, rhythmic growl. "And so is your spirit. In my world, we fix both." If this story moved you, subscribe for more. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Beverly's suitcase exploded across the polished floor of Incheon Airport, lace underwear tangling with crumpled blouses, a wedding program fluttering like a dying bird. Travelers stepped around the wreckage, their eyes sliding past Beverly as if poverty were contagious. Beverly didn't move to collect the debris of her former life. The woman who would have scrambled on her knees, apologizing to strangers, had died somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. 3 men in black suits materialized through the crowd, their movements synchronized like predators who'd hunted together for years. The shortest one, though still taller than most, crouched beside Beverly's ruined luggage, his hand hovering over a silk scarf Michael had once said made her look almost elegant. Beverly's fingers didn't twitch toward it. "Miss Johnson." The tallest man's voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to obedience. "I am Mr. Choi. Mr. Kang requests your presence." Beverly looked up at Mr. Choi with eyes that held no questions, no fear, no spark of self-preservation. Her throat tasted like metal, the same copper bitterness that had flooded her mouth when Michael's microphone had broadcast her worthlessness to 200 witnesses. Mr. Choi's expression shifted, a hairline crack in his professional mask. Beverly watched him recognize something in her absence of reaction. A woman with nothing left to protect was more dangerous than any weapon. Across the city, Kang Ji-wan rewound the security footage for the 3rd time. The American woman should have collapsed when his men surrounded her. She should have begged, bargained, or at least asked why. Instead, Beverly Johnson stood perfectly still, her shoulders carrying a weight Ji-wan recognized, the kind that either crushed people or forged them into something unbreakable. His finger traced her face on the screen, pausing on the hollow beneath her eyes where sleep had abandoned her. "Bring her," Ji-wan commanded into his phone, his voice dropping to the register he reserved for acquisitions he refused to lose. "And Mr. Choi, if anyone touches her belongings with anything less than reverence, they'll answer to me personally." Beverly followed Mr. Choi toward the black sedan idling at the curb, leaving her broken suitcase bleeding across the airport floor. Behind her, a security guard started collecting her scattered clothes with hands that suddenly trembled. The elevator climbed 63 floors without a single shudder, the kind of engineering that whispered wealth in a language Beverly had never been fluent in. Mr. Choi's reflection watched Beverly in the polished steel doors, his hand resting near his jacket's inner pocket where something angular pressed against the fabric. Beverly's pulse didn't quicken. Death would be simpler than returning to the woman Michael's laughter had created. The doors opened onto a penthouse that made Beverly's breathing catch, not from beauty, but from the violence of the contrast. Marble floors stretched toward floor-to-ceiling windows where Seoul glittered like shattered diamonds, each light representing a life that had never stood at an altar and been declared unmarketable. Beverly's reflection fractured across the marble, a plus-sized black woman in a wrinkled dress standing in a space that had been designed to exclude everything she represented. "Miss Johnson." The voice came from behind her, lower than Mr. Choi's, carrying the cadence of someone who'd learned English from British tutors but spoke it like a weapon. Beverly turned to face Kang Jiwan and her throat constricted, not from fear, but from the wrongness of his age. Jiwan couldn't be older than 35, his face carved with a kind of sharp angles that belonged on statues commemorating wars, not men who collected broken women from airports. Jiwan crossed the space between them with movements that suggested violence held in reserve, each step measured. His eyes tracked Beverly's face with the focus of someone reading a contract for loopholes, and Beverly felt the weight of that examination in her bones. Michael had looked at her once with hunger. Jiwan looked at Beverly like she was a puzzle he intended to solve even if it required breaking her apart. "You didn't flinch when my men surrounded you," Jiwan said, and the observation landed like an accusation. "You didn't negotiate or plead or perform the expected terror. Why?" Beverly's laugh scraped her throat raw. "What's left to threaten when someone's already taken everything in front of witnesses?" Jiwan's expression shifted, something predatory sliding behind his eyes that made Beverly's skin prickle with awareness that she'd just revealed weakness disguised as strength. He moved closer, close enough that Beverly could see the thin scar threading through his left eyebrow, a reminder that even men who commanded elevators and penthouses had once bled. "You survived something that would break most people," Jiwan said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in Beverly's chest. "That kind of resilience doesn't just happen. It's forged." Beverly's fingers curled into fists, nails biting crescents into her palms, the only thing keeping her from asking why a Korean mafia boss spoke like he understood the specific architecture of her destruction. Jiwan's gaze dropped to Beverly's hands, registering the white pressure of her knuckles before returning to her face. "I'm offering you the guest suite. No conditions. No expectations. Just time to." "Nothing's free," Beverly interrupted, and her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the exhaustion she'd been carrying since Michael's microphone had amplified her humiliation. "Men don't collect broken women without expecting something." Jiwan smiled, and the expression held no warmth, only the satisfaction of someone who'd just confirmed a hypothesis. "Consider it an investment, Miss Johnson. I collect rare things. Your resilience is priceless." Beverly followed Jiwan down a corridor lined with art that probably cost more than her entire existence, each painting depicting scenes of battle, warriors refusing to fall even as arrows pierced their flesh. The bedroom suite Jiwan opened was larger than the apartment Beverly had shared with her mother before cancer had taken her, before Beverly had learned that being plus-sized and black meant apologizing for occupying space. The closet held designer clothes in Beverly's exact size, tags still attached, as if Jiwan had known her measurements before his men had ever approached her at the airport. Beverly's hands trembled as she touched the fabric of a silk blouse, and the trembling terrified her more than Jiwan's calculated kindness ever could. Beverly stepped into the Gangnam boutique alone, testing the boundaries of Jiwan's sanctuary, and the owner's eyes swept across Beverly's body like a coroner examining a corpse. The woman's lips curved into something that might have passed for a smile in a culture that weaponized politeness, but her words sliced clean through the pretense. "We don't carry sizes for women of your particular needs," the owner said in English sharp enough to draw blood. "Perhaps a tent shop would better serve you." Beverly's throat closed, Michael's voice echoing through the boutique's pristine air. "You're not presentable." The copper taste flooded Beverly's mouth again, and for one devastating moment, Beverly was back at that altar, 200 people laughing at the spectacle of her presumption. Beverly turned to leave, and the owner's satisfaction hung in the air like perfume. 3 hours later, Jiwan appeared in Beverly's suite doorway, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying the temperature of liquid nitrogen. Beverly watched Jiwan speak in rapid Korean, each word landing with surgical precision, and through the phone speaker came a woman's voice, the boutique owner, rising from professional to pleading to something that sounded like begging. Jiwan ended the call with a single tap, the gesture as final as an executioner's blade. "The boutique chain is mine now," Jiwan said, adjusting his cufflinks with movements that suggested this was simply another Tuesday. "The owner is unemployed. In my world, disrespect has consequences that compound with interest." Beverly's hands trembled against the silk sheets, caught between the horror of witnessing a life destroyed and the savage satisfaction of watching someone else bleed for once. Jiwan crossed to Beverly's bedside, placing a leather portfolio between them like an offering, and Beverly's fingers traced the embossed logo, Kang Enterprises International. "I need someone to review these contracts," Jiwan said, and the request felt like a test Beverly couldn't afford to fail. "Unless you'd prefer to remain a guest indefinitely." Beverly opened the portfolio, her accountant's eye catching the numbers that had been her only language before Michael had taught her the dialect of worthlessness. The third contract made Beverly's breath hitch, a discrepancy hidden in subclause terminology, $3 million bleeding through a loophole someone had deliberately engineered. Beverly's pen moved across the margin, calculations spilling out in the shorthand her professors had once called architectural. Joanne leaned over Beverly's shoulder, his breath warm against her neck as he studied her annotations, and Beverly felt the shift in the air between them, the way predators recalibrate when they realize their prey has teeth. "You're not a charity case, Miss Johnson," Joanne said, his voice dropping to that register that made Beverly's pulse spike. "You're an asset I was fortunate to find." Beverly looked up at Joanne, and for the first time since the altar, something besides emptiness moved through her chest. Beverly's Korean tutor arrived at dawn, and by the third week, Beverly could parse the subordinate clauses that hid liabilities in contracts the way her mother had once identified cancer spreading through X-rays, early, accurately, and with the grim certainty of someone who understood that missing details killed. Joanne left legal briefs outside Beverly's door like other men left flowers, each one a test Beverly passed by finding the fractures no one else had noticed. The work consumed Beverly's hours, and somewhere between contract law and conversational Korean, the woman who'd stood hollow-eyed at Incheon Airport began dissolving into someone Beverly didn't recognize in the penthouse mirrors. Beverly's clothes hung differently now, 20 pounds lighter not from starvation but from the way confidence rewired a body's architecture. Shoulders back, spine straight, each step landing with purpose instead of apology. Joanne watched Beverly move through his offices with eyes that tracked every shift, every increment of transformation, but never spoke the observation aloud. His silence felt more intimate than Michael's constant critiques had ever been, as if Joanne understood that commenting would make Beverly's evolution about him instead of about Beverly reclaiming territory Michael had taught her to abandon. The business dinner ambushed Beverly with its casualness, Joanne's hand at Beverly's elbow, guiding her into a private room where Seoul's elite waited like wolves scenting wounded prey. Beverly wore Chanel that Joanne's assistant had selected, black fabric that celebrated curves Michael had called problematic, and every eye in the room catalogued Beverly's presence with a kind of arithmetic that measured worth in inches and skin tone. Beverly's throat tightened, her mother's voice ghosting through memory. "Baby, some rooms will never want you, no matter how perfect you make yourself." Beverly had proven that truth at an altar. The executive sitting across from Joanne spoke in Korean, his tone carrying the particular smugness of men who believed their language granted immunity from consequences. Beverly caught every third word, enough to understand the shape of the insult even before her tutor's lessons clicked into place. "Your American charity project." Beverly's fingers whitened around her chopsticks, Michael's laughter echoing through the private room's expensive silence, and Joanne's hand moved to Beverly's back with enough pressure that Beverly felt the heat of his palm through Chanel silk. The touch wasn't protective, it was possessive, claiming Beverly as territory the executive had just trespassed upon. "My American executive," Joanne said in English cold enough to frost the room's temperature, each word enunciated with the precision of someone delivering a death sentence, who's smarter than your entire board combined. The executive's face drained to the color of uncooked rice. Beverly felt the shift ripple through the room, not pity for the plus-sized black woman Joanne had dragged to dinner, but calculation about the plus-sized black woman Joanne had just elevated above them. Beverly's pulse hammered against her throat, and for the first time since the altar, the rhythm felt like possibility instead of panic. Joanne's hand stayed pressed against Beverly's spine throughout the meal, a brand that announced ownership, partnership, or something more dangerous that Beverly couldn't name but felt burning through every layer of fabric and skin. The other executives directed questions to Beverly about market projections, regulatory frameworks, and Beverly answered in Korean fractured enough to be endearing but accurate enough to be undeniable. Each correct response landed like a small detonation, and Beverly watched these men recalibrate their assessment of what she represented. When the dinner ended, Joanne kept his hand on Beverly's back as they left, and Beverly realized the walls she'd built after Michael's microphone had broadcast her worthlessness were crumbling not from Joanne's assault, but from Beverly's own recognition that maybe, she'd been right to build empires all along, just with the wrong architect beside her. The emerald gown arrived in a box that cost more than Beverly's wedding dress had, and when Beverly lifted the fabric, the silk moved like water designed to worship every curve Michael had called a corporate liability. Joanne stood in the doorway of Beverly's suite, his eyes tracking the way Beverly's fingers trembled against the emerald, Michael's favorite color, the color the replacement bride had worn in the front pew while Beverly's humiliation echoed through a microphone. "You'll outshine everyone," Joanne said, and the promise landed like a threat against every woman who would stand in that ballroom judging Beverly's audacity. The charity gala glittered with Seoul's elite, women whose bodies had been carved into acceptable shapes through starvation and surgery, and their eyes dissected Beverly's emerald silk with the precision of coroners determining cause of death. 3 of them materialized at Beverly's elbow like smoke, their smiles sharp enough to draw blood without leaving evidence. "How brave," the tallest one said in English that carried a British boarding school accent, "to wear something so unapologetically visible. Most women would hide such boldness." Beverly's throat closed, the familiar copper taste flooding her mouth, and before Beverly could deploy the apologetic smile she'd perfected after years of making herself smaller, Joanne's hand found the small of Beverly's back. His touch burned through emerald silk like a brand, and when Joanne spoke, his voice carried across the ballroom with the amplification of someone accustomed to commanding silence. "I'm announcing a $5 million donation," Joanne declared, his eyes never leaving the 3 women whose smiles had frozen into masks of calculation, to rename this ballroom the Beverly Johnson Hall. The room's oxygen evacuated in a single collective breath. Beverly's knees threatened collapse, her mother's voice whispering through the silence. "Baby, sometimes the world gives you flowers after it's already buried you." But Beverly wasn't buried. She was standing in emerald silk while Soul's elite recalibrated every assumption they'd made about the plus-sized black woman they dismissed as Joanne's charity experiment. Joanne's hand slid from Beverly's back to her waist, pulling Beverly onto the dance floor before the whispers could fully ignite, and his body pressed against Beverly's curves with enough certainty that Beverly felt every place their bodies connected like small detonations. Joanne's mouth found Beverly's ear, his breath hot against skin that had forgotten what desire felt like before humiliation had taught Beverly that wanting was dangerous. "They're intimidated because you're everything they're taught not to be," Joanne whispered, his lips brushing the shell of Beverly's ear. "Authentic." Beverly laughed, and the sound ripped from her throat like something that had been caged since Michael's microphone had broadcast her worthlessness, raw and genuine and utterly free. Joanne's arms tightened around Beverly's waist, and Beverly felt the shift between them, the way protective calculation was dissolving into something more dangerous that made Beverly's pulse spike in her throat and heat pool low in her stomach. The city lights bled through Joanne's office windows at 3 in the morning, turning contract pages into illuminated manuscripts, and Beverly's red pen moved across clause 17 with the kind of precision her mother had once used to mark Beverly's homework, exacting, thorough, refusing to accept mediocrity even when the world had already decided Beverly's worth. Joanne watched Beverly work from across his desk, his tie loosened, his guard lowered in ways Beverly had learned meant exhaustion or calculation, and tonight Beverly couldn't distinguish which. "Why did you really help me?" Beverly asked, her pen stilling mid-notation, and the question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. "Men like you don't collect broken women from airports without a strategy." Joanne's jaw tightened, something fracturing behind his eyes that looked like the moment before stone cracked under pressure. Beverly had seen that expression once before, in her own mirror after Michael's microphone had broadcast her humiliation, right before Beverly had stopped performing survival and simply surrendered to the emptiness. "At that airport," Joanne said, his voice dropping to that register that vibrated in Beverly's chest, "I saw someone who refused to perform grief for an audience." Joanne stood, crossing to Beverly's side of the desk, and Beverly's pulse spiked as Joanne's proximity eliminated the professional distance that had kept this confession theoretical. "You didn't cry. Didn't beg. Didn't apologize for existing in a space that didn't want you." Beverly's fingers whitened around her pen, Michael's voice echoing through the office's shadows. "You're a liability. That wasn't strength. That was nothing left to lose." "I've spent 20 years in a world where everyone performs," Joanne continued, his hand reaching for Beverly's face with movements that suggested touching her required courage he rarely needed. "You were just real." Beverly's breath caught, her mother's warning surfacing like a drowning swimmer gasping for air. "Baby, men who claim they want real women still expect performances." Beverly had performed for Michael, smaller portions, strategic silences, apologetic laughter, and he'd still handed Beverly a check at the altar. "I'm falling for you," Joanne said, and the confession landed like a grenade with the pin already pulled. "Have been since that security footage showed me a woman who survived public execution and still stood upright." Beverly's throat closed, copper taste flooding her mouth, because falling implied landing and landing implied shattering, and Beverly had already shattered once in front of witnesses. "What if this is temporary? What if I'm just?" Joanne's hands cupped Beverly's face with enough pressure that Beverly felt the calluses on his palms, reminders that even Mafia bosses built their empires through violence that left marks. "I don't do temporary, Beverly," Joanne said, his mouth inches from Beverly's, close enough that Beverly felt his breath mixing with hers. "I build empires that last." Joanne kissed Beverly, and the contact felt like something Beverly had been starving for without recognizing the hunger. Not gentle, not apologetic, but claiming Beverly with the certainty of someone who'd already decided she was worth the war her presence would inevitably trigger. Beverly kissed Joanne back, her walls crumbling, and for the first time since the altar, Beverly believed she deserved to be chosen instead of discarded. Beverly's assistant placed the portfolio on her desk with a kind of reverence reserved for documents that determined whether companies lived or died, and when Beverly opened the cover, Michael Smith's signature stared back at her from the letterhead like a ghost that refused to stay buried. The proposal requested a $15 million partnership with Kang Enterprises, the kind of lifeline that separated bankruptcy from survival, and Beverly's red pen hovered over the first page as a throat constricted with a familiar copper taste of humiliation that had never fully washed away. Joanne's hand found Beverly's shoulder in the empty boardroom before the meeting, his touch grounding Beverly to the present instead of the altar where Michael's microphone had declared her unmarketable. "You don't have to do this," Joanne said, his voice carrying the protective edge that made Beverly's pulse spike. "I can assign someone else." Beverly's fingers tightened around her pen until her knuckles whitened, her mother's voice whispering through the boardroom's expensive silence. "Baby, the best revenge is making them watch you thrive." "No," Beverly said, and her voice didn't crack even though her hands trembled. "I want him to see exactly what he discarded." The door opened at precisely 2 o'clock, and Michael Smith walked into the boardroom with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for cruelty. His eyes swept past Beverly twice before recognition detonated across his face, draining the color from his skin until he looked like a corpse performing the motions of being alive. Beverly watched Michael's gaze catalog her transformation, the Armani suit that celebrated curves instead of apologizing for them, the diamond studs Joanne had given her, the command presence that made Michael's own posture collapse inward. "Beverly." Michael's voice cracked on her name, and the sound tasted like vindication mixed with something darker that Beverly couldn't name. I didn't know you were in Seoul. I didn't know you were the reviewing executive." Beverly interrupted, her tone carrying the temperature of liquid nitrogen. "Please sit down, Mr. Smith. Let's discuss your proposal." Michael stumbled into the chair across from Beverly, his hand shaking as he pushed the presentation folder toward her, and Beverly noticed the trembling, the same trembling that had consumed Beverly's hands when Michael had pressed that check into her palm at the altar. The symmetry felt like justice wearing a designer suit. Beverly flipped through Michael's proposal with the clinical precision her accounting professors had praised, finding the fractures immediately, projections inflated by 30%, market analysis based on data from competitors who'd already failed, risk assessment that ignored regulatory changes any competent executive would have caught. Michael had always been better at performance than substance, and his proposal proved that charm couldn't compensate for incompetence when stakes were real. "Your projections are unrealistic, Mr. Smith," Beverly said, her pen marking the third critical error with a slash that felt like drawing blood. "Like your assessment of people." Michael's face crumpled, desperation replacing the confidence he'd worn like armor. "Beverly, please. I made a mistake. I was under pressure from the board, from my family. I always cared about you. You just needed someone presentable," Beverly finished, Michael's words from the altar echoing between them like a curse that had finally found its target. "Someone the board wouldn't pity." Michael lunged forward, his hands reaching across the table toward Beverly in a gesture that looked like prayer but felt like assault. "I was wrong. I was stupid. I've regretted it every day since. Please, Beverly. My company's survival depends on this deal. I'm begging you." The door opened, and Joanne entered with the kind of timing that suggested he'd been watching through the security cameras, reading Beverly's body language like a language only they spoke. Joanne crossed to Beverly's chair, standing behind her with his hand resting on the leather back, and the gesture transformed the boardroom's power dynamic from ambiguous to absolute. Michael's eyes tracked the intimacy of Joanne's proximity, the way Joanne's stance declared ownership and partnership simultaneously, and Beverly watched understanding detonate across Michael's face. He hadn't just lost Beverly, he'd lost her to someone who saw empires where Michael had only seen liabilities. "The proposal is rejected," Beverly said, closing the folder with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid sealing. "Kang Enterprises doesn't partner with companies built on unrealistic projections and executives who measure worth by board approval." Michael's mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish drowning in air, and when no sound emerged, Joanne's hand moved to Beverly's shoulder, not protective, but celebratory, acknowledging the execution Beverly had just performed with nothing but competence and the truth Michael had taught her to speak. Michael's fist slammed against the boardroom table hard enough to rattle the water glasses, and the sound echoed through the room like a gunshot that had finally found its target after years of misfiring. His face contorted into something ugly that Beverly recognized from the altar, the expression of a man who'd miscalculated power and was watching his empire crumble into ash. "This is vindictive," Michael snarled, spittle collecting at the corners of his mouth. "You're punishing me because I was honest about what the world demanded. I made you stronger. Beverly. You should be thanking me." Beverly's laugh ripped from her throat like broken glass, sharp enough to draw blood, and the sound made Michael flinch backward as if Beverly had struck him. Her mother's voice whispered through the boardroom's expensive silence. "Baby, men who break you will always claim they built you." Beverly had learned that lesson at an altar where 200 witnesses had watched Michael build his future on the foundation of Beverly's public execution. "You didn't make me anything, Michael," Beverly said, her voice carrying the temperature of a eulogy delivered without grief. "You revealed who you truly are, someone who measures worth by board approval instead of substance." Beverly stood, her Armani suit catching the light in ways that made Michael's off-the-rack desperation look even cheaper. "I'm grateful. It freed me to find someone who values what actually matters." Michael's hands whitened around the table edge, his breathing ragged, and Beverly watched him recognize that the woman he discarded like defective merchandise had become something he could never afford to acquire. "You can't do this. My company will collapse. Hundreds of jobs." "Should have been your concern before you built projections on fantasy," Beverly interrupted, and the words landed like a judge's gavel ending a trial that had already been decided. Joanne moved from behind Beverly's chair to stand beside her, his hand finding the small of Beverly's back with a kind of possessive certainty that transformed the gesture from protection into declaration. "Mr. Smith," Joanne said, his voice carrying the clinical precision of a surgeon removing diseased tissue, "you discarded a queen because of your limited vision. That's not her failure. That's yours." Joanne's other hand lifted toward the security camera, a subtle signal that made the boardroom door open immediately. 2 security guards entered with the synchronized efficiency of men who'd performed this particular escort dozens of times, and Michael's face drained to the color of paper as he realized this wasn't negotiation, this was execution. "Security will escort you out," Joanne continued, his tone suggesting this was already ancient history not worth additional discussion. "Permanently." Michael stumbled to his feet, his mouth opening to launch another desperate plea, but Beverly had already turned away, her attention shifting to the contract spread across the table as if Michael had transformed into furniture too insignificant to warrant acknowledgement. The dismissal landed harder than any words Beverly could have weaponized, and Michael's broken sound, something between a sob and a scream, followed him as security led him toward the door. Beverly didn't watch Michael leave. Her pen moved across the next contract with the steady precision of someone who'd already moved beyond revenge into something more dangerous: absolute indifference. Justice didn't just taste sweet. It tasted like freedom from needing Michael's validation to measure her own worth. The garden bloomed with cherry blossoms that fell like benedictions instead of judgments, and Beverly stood beneath an arch woven from silk and resilience, wearing a gown that celebrated every curve Michael had once called unmarketable, custom champagne lace that moved like liquid confidence across skin that had learned to stop apologizing for existing. 50 guests watched Beverly and Joanne exchange vows in Korean and English, each person present because they'd earned witness privilege through loyalty instead of obligation, and the absence of performative crowds made the ceremony feel like oxygen after years of suffocation. Joanne's hands trembled as he slid the platinum band onto Beverly's finger, and Beverly felt the tremor echo through her own body. Not fear, but the recognition that they were both building something neither had trusted themselves to want. The officiant's voice carried across the garden like music, and when Joanne kissed Beverly, the contact tasted like freedom mixed with a particular sweetness of choosing to be chosen. The reception transformed the garden into something that felt more like revolution than celebration, and Beverly's toast included a video call projected onto silk screens, the community center Beverly had opened 3 months prior with her Kang Enterprises earnings. 12 plus-sized women of color appeared on screen, each one running businesses Beverly had helped fund through microloans and mentorship, and their voices overlapped with gratitude that made Beverly's throat tighten with a kind of tears that healed instead of destroyed. "You gave us what nobody else would," the woman on screen said, her bakery's logo visible behind her, Curves and Confections, established 6 weeks ago with Beverly's seed money. "You saw us when the world taught us we were invisible." Beverly's mother's voice whispered through the garden's cherry blossoms. "Baby, the best revenge is building the table they said you'd never sit at, then pulling up chairs for everyone they left outside." Beverly had built that table, and the weight of it felt like purpose instead of performance. Joanne pulled Beverly onto the makeshift dance floor as strings played something slow and devastating, and his arms circled Beverly's waist with a kind of certainty that suggested he'd memorized the geography of her body and found every curve worth celebrating. Beverly's head rested against Joanne's chest, feeling his heartbeat sync with hers, and the rhythm felt like home in a language Beverly had spent 32 years trying to learn. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, Beverly whispered against Joanne's shoulder, her voice cracking on the last word because gratitude still felt dangerous. Too close to the apologies Michael had trained Beverly to offer for simply existing. Joanne's hand moved to Beverly's chin, tilting her face upward until their eyes met, and the intensity in his gaze made Beverly's pulse spike in her throat. I only showed you what was always there, Joanne said, his thumb tracing the curve of Beverly's jaw with reverence that felt like prayer. You did the rest. Beverly laughed, and the sound carried across the garden like something wild finally released from captivity, raw and genuine and utterly free. Joanne spun Beverly under the cherry blossoms, her champagne gown catching light and movement, and Beverly caught a glimpse of her reflection in the garden's koi pond. A plus-sized black woman radiant with a kind of confidence that came not from fitting into spaces designed to exclude her, but from building new spaces where exclusion couldn't survive. The wedding photographer captured the moment, Beverly mid-spin, laughing with her head thrown back, Joanne watching her with the expression of someone who'd found treasure in the wreckage everyone else had abandoned. But the photograph couldn't capture the most important transformation, the way Beverly's soul had stopped performing survival and started practicing joy. As the reception continued into twilight, Beverly stood at the garden's edge, watching the community center's video call show more women sharing success stories. Businesses launched, dreams realized, lives rebuilt on foundations Beverly had helped them pour. Joanne's arms wrapped around Beverly from behind, and she leaned into the embrace, finally understanding that the altar where Michael had executed her worth had actually been the doorway to the empire she'd been building all along. Beverly Johnson had learned the hardest truth. Sometimes you have to be publicly discarded before you can be privately discovered. Sometimes the world has to reject you before you can finally accept yourself. And sometimes the man who hands you a check at the altar is actually handing you permission to become the queen you'd always been, just with the wrong audience watching. The cherry blossoms fell like applause, and Beverly caught one in her palm, studying its perfect imperfection before releasing it to the wind. Not despite her journey, but because of it.